Welcome to the Future of Field Service podcast. I'm your host, Sarah Nicastro. Today, we are going to be revisiting the core concepts of industrial automation. I will be honest, I have a lot of conversations on this podcast that I feel I know a lot about and am very comfortable with. This is not one of them. So this is good, though, because the reason this podcast exists is to learn and grow and expand. And so I'm excited for today's discussion. So today I'm welcoming back Kevin Starr, who is the North American Service Development Manager at ABB. Kevin was interviewed for episode 59. So it's been a while, Kevin. Welcome back.
Thank you. Thank you. Well, I've got a great book for you to help with your understanding.
Yes. Yeah. And that's what we're going to be talking. By the end of the episode, I should be an expert. No.
That's right.
Okay. So before we dig into the topic, tell everyone just a bit about yourself, your role, etc., and then we'll get into it.
Sure. My name's Kevin Starr. I've been with ABB for a while. I say it's 35 years. I tell people I started when I was 5. It's been an amazing journey of automation, troubleshooting, and seeing the evolution of automation. And I've had the opportunity to work in all over the world in all kinds of industries. And along the way, I was able to learn process control and industrial automation and loop tuning. And I've been able to present the material, develop training classes, develop tools and software and solutions. And a book that I wrote, it's close to 30 years ago, has really resonated with the community and is sort of having a resurgence as we're going into this kind of industrial revolution. So I get to work in the service space. I get to help customers improve production quality and reduce the cost to produce and help grab onto and hold on to our tribal knowledge.
Yeah. Okay, cool. So you recently re-released this book that you wrote for the first time, I think you said close to 30 years ago, right?
Yeah.
So tell us a little bit about your journey writing the book. What was sort of the catalyst for the first round of writing it? And how does that compare with the version that was recently re-released?
Well, it's been amazing. Is when we started this journey, it's been a long time ago, 30 some years ago. I was what they call a systems engineer, where we do process control and startup of a paper machine, and we had a control system that you would have to configure. And when I go into college and had a background in electrical engineering and a minor in process control, where we had learned about root locus and Bode plots and poles and zeros and a lot of mathematical rigor. But the application in the real world just wasn't really there. And I went to this paper mill down in Vicksburg, Mississippi, and the process control manager said, "You can't touch my machine unless you tell me how these numbers work." And I was like, "Oh, well, here's my binder. I was given this binder, we called it the golden binder. If you plug these numbers in, everything will work." And he says, "No, you can't touch my machine." And I knew I wanted to go home eventually. So I went and started cramming and studying and trying to figure out how to answer what's a proportional gain, what's an integral gain, what's dead time. And so I was able to tell him that I knew what I was talking about. He let me set up his machine and it ran good and I could go home. And that was the spark, really, is like, I wonder if anybody else is struggling with this. And then as I was actually happened to move into instructing and teaching, and people started asking questions about tuning. That's when we were going from pneumatic and 4 to 20 milliamp current loops into the distributed control system. And so the controllers were no longer operating once a minute. They were operating every 5 seconds or every second. So some of the maybe sloppy techniques that we had grown up with weren't working. And those, I started teaching classes, and then the students would say, "Hey, Kevin, could you write this stuff down? Because we're taking too many notes." So each class, I would write it down. And then Jim Flading once said, "Kevin, if you would just write this as a book, we would buy it." And then I had a boss at the time that let me take several months to compile the information, and the single loop control methods loop tuning book was born. It is kind of funny is the first book, we sent it to a wordsmith to have them edit it, and it came back with so many corrections. Their question was, "Is English your native language?" I still find that funny. I can't spell. I'm terrible at English, and yet I wrote a book.
Yeah.
And that was 30 years ago, and this is the 4th edition that's coming out. And I would say I was fortunate to, I had some extremely talented mentors, that kind of took me by the hand and showed me some of the kind of how the tuning and the tune by feel. And I was able to write that down and then help other people understand tuning from a much more practical perspective.
Mm-hmm.
The theory is great, but it has to make sense. So I was able to work with hundreds, if not thousands of people, and then as the controls took off and things grew, people sort of just used auto tuners and, oh, we don't need tuning, and they moved to advanced process control. And now people are coming back and saying, hey, Kevin, all of our advanced controls sit on this thing called a control loop. Can you help us again? And that's was really, we said, well, let's dust this thing off.
Mm-hmm.
And it's amazing once you hit the resonant of the theory of control tuning. It's applied to every application, every industrial controller. It's non-platform dependent, it's vendor agnostic, and that's what's helped me stay relevant and have such a long career.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So, how would you describe the current sort of state of the industry?
Um, well, that's what we're trying to keep our. I still work at ABB, and we're constantly working with our customers. And I would say after we've all gone through this pandemic, and hopefully are coming out of it. But what I would say we've seen, beyond our wildest imagination, was the remote work.
Mm-hmm.
Doors have just opened up for remote capability, remote access, being able to apply application of technology remotely. Loop tuning is one of those things that, years ago, customers were like, you have to be sitting in front of my machine. If you're going to do an evaluation or a step test, you have to be here. That stigma has been removed, and we're doing remote tuning and commissioning from anywhere in the world.
Mm-hmm.
And you couple that with the other change that the Industrial Revolution 4.0 has introduced is one person used to be able to know everything about the technology they were working on.
Mm-hmm.
That has passed. They say 2015 was about the point where the Industrial Revolution really started. And if you look at the amount of knowledge that a person has to have from, loop tuning is one thing, but so is cybersecurity, so is IT and OT and alarm management, and the list goes on and on. And so what's happening is people are only getting smaller and smaller pieces in an academic setting. So no one's really an expert, but everybody's supposed to know everything. So what
Mm-hmm.
we're seeing is the state of the industry is our clients are saying, can we have a sliver of all these expertise? And we can't have just one person. How do we do that? And that's where we've introduced the concept of the right person at the right time with the right solution drives the right
Mm-hmm.
value. It's kind of another spark along the way here is my son, who's now 5 or 6 years out of college. He took a class at a high university on loop tuning, and he goes, Dad, I can now talk to you. And I said, okay, let me see what you're doing. And I'm like, oh my goodness, that's all you're learning? And they showed me their videos, and I said, well, your dad used to do this stuff. And he goes, really? And I said, we got a videographer, and I said, get your camera, let's go. And we recorded every chapter as a YouTube video,
Mm-hmm.
and primarily show him how to pass his class. And that has exploded. And your listeners can go to Kevin Starr, ABBPID, search that in your YouTube, and you'll
Mm-hmm.
see ABB allowed us to make those available to the industry for free. And one of them has over 400,000 views, which is
Mm-hmm.
kind of crazy, is to see that has really prompted part of the state of the industry is we're a Google.
Yeah.
If you can't learn it through Google, it doesn't matter. And so now people are finding this technology and finding how to do things, and we've made it available. And then
Mm-hmm.
almost always people will read it and say, well, I'd like to have a reference book. So they'll send us a note, and then they can get the book now through ABB.
Mm-hmm. Very cool. Okay, so let's walk through some of the components that are covered in the book. So the
Okay.
first one is around process identification and modeling.
Yeah, it's challenging. A lot of people get into loop tuning. They want to talk about Ziegler-Nichols or lambda control or direct synthesis or pole zero placement, and that goes kind of over people's head. And then you say, well, I have an ABB or an Allen Bradley or a Fisher or a Yokogawa or a controller, and then they use different. And then there's different types, so people get kind of caught up in the math really, really quick. And I take it back to, we start off with process. Every input output relationships, like if you go to steer your car and you turn the steering wheel and the car doesn't turn, you don't speed up, you stop. And that's the way it is with actuation devices. You have to inject energy or figure out some way of looking at historical data to find the causality between that input and how's the process going to respond. Is it going to move really, really slow? You think of like a fire hose or a garden hose. You can't adjust those the same. So there
Mm-hmm.
are techniques and methods that we cover for identifying process types and how you come up with numerical numbers to represent, okay, how much did it move and how long did it take to get there. So we really try to boil things down. This all goes into calculus and differential equations, but not in this first book. We just say, okay, these 6 or so different types of processes, was your self-regulating or non-self-regulating, and here's how you would do an identification using current bump test techniques or historical data. And if you can't identify what's going to happen when you move the actuator, you're not ready to go into the next levels of tuning.
Mm-hmm. Okay. And then you talk about the technology that's being used.
The technology is, we'd like to think that everybody has an ABB controller out there, but industry's been out there for 35 years, so or longer than that. And so you have to be able to adapt the language to the type of control that's being used. There's actually three main branches. There's parallel, classical, and standard. Those are the three classes of the mathematical formulae, which is interesting. If you go clear back to the pneumatic controllers with sniffers and baffles, they literally developed software around physical components that they took into the digital world, and there was three versions. Well, there's the mod systems, the Taylor mod, the ABB, the Allen. They're different companies have different embodiments, but if you understand that, you can map your tuning into their language. That's where a lot of people get kind of messed up with tuning, is they may have two different controllers and one set up with a particular equation, one set up with another, and they put the same numbers in both. One explodes, one doesn't. And there's this stigma of process control that is black magic and you can't understand it. We really try to demystify that with the book.
Mm-hmm. Okay. And so how are you helping people take sort of the process identification and the modeling, understanding the language of the technology they're using, and then getting to the desired outcome?
Well, that's great. Is tuning, a lot of people is a guess and check. Well, I'll
Mm-hmm.
just throw some numbers in. See, that's how I was brought up. Just throw these numbers in, it'll work. Well, no, that's that tune by feel. In the old days, you could actually feel the knob and you could feel the system calm down. In today's world of electronics, you don't have that feel. So you have to rely on the numbers and the response. And the response is, do you want to respond? Do you want the response when you change the reference to happen fast or slow? Imagine, when you get in your car, if it's cold out and you want it to get hot. Well, you kind of have an idea of how the heater works. So normally you turn the heat way, way up and you're trying to speed up how fast a car can heat up. So you don't just put the valve where it ends up, you go really fast and then you come back into it. The reason you can do that in your car is you understand the dynamics and you understand you're doing it by hand. We can do the same thing with automation. We can make a process respond fast or slow. We can give it a percent overshoot. We can actually tune out a particular frequency. I guess that's what I find fascinating about tuning. Once you understand that the control will respond to the way you tune it, even if you don't know what you're doing. If you know what you're doing, you can do incredible things with process control.
Mm-hmm. So you mentioned, when we were talking about the catalyst for the book, you had gone to college, and when you got into, the act of actually doing the work, you realized there was sort of a gap between what you were taught and what you were expected to do. And so the content was kind of geared at not only closing that gap for you, but for other people as well. So then when you talk about present day, it seems like the gap still exists. It's just different than it was, right? So there's still this need to sort of close this gap between, the textbook learnings and the real world. It's just the realities of that look a bit different. So you mentioned that in today's workforce, right, we know that people are stretched to find talent. You mentioned that there's this desire for a little bit of all different types of expertise versus, someone that's an expert in one thing. What does this kind of lead to in terms of how we need to educate the workforce and provide, training and knowledge and enablement that fits, what companies have to accomplish today?
That's great. That's a lot there. And I keep coming back to spheres of influence. There's only so much one person can do. And you can chase rabbits if you're not careful. And so I always try to boil it down to what's the core value. Like I've had a chance to work in a lot of industries, and so production quality, cost to produce, safety, transportation. You figure out what's core. What are the turns in their factory that makes money, and then how can you take your knowledge and help leverage that goal instead of getting caught up in, well, let's use this dashboard or this tuning tool or this whatever. Those change, but the cores don't. And so
Mm-hmm.
how do you link to that? And that's what I found with this is the tribal knowledge that we grew up with. A lot of people were fortunate enough to work in an industry for 20, 25 years. You kind of grew up with this. New people are coming in and they have a different paradigm. It's like, why are you doing it? And which is great. We want that. But we have to be able to adapt to that, to be able to bring information to a heads up display so they can be taking data, convert it to information that they can take action on that creates value. If you can't do that link, then you just have a fancy dashboard or a treadmill that you hang your clothes on in your bedroom. It's not really good.
Mm-hmm.
You don't get sucked into technology for the sake of technology. How does it apply to taking action that creates value?
Mm-hmm.
And that's, I don't know, that's a lot there, but is as we've transitioned and our industry has grown and the technology has grown and the demands on people have grown, we call it work-life balance. That's been disrupted. Is people are like, when that phone rings, what do I have to do? And when I walk into the building, there's so much. How do I prioritize so that I can give the person the right things to do at the right time? If, for example, loop tuning, when I first started to tune 1, 2 loops, it'd take a couple of days.
Mm-hmm.
And we figured out how to do 10 loops in a week, and people paid us a lot of money for me to run around and tune 10 loops, 10 control loops, like a flow or a pressure, or a temperature, a level, or machine speed, or consistency, those types of things. And then all of a sudden, technology kept growing, and now we could do 100 loops. And then if you couldn't do 100 loops in a week, they wouldn't buy it. And then now we're up to 2, 3 thousand loops, and you need to do it instantly.
Mm-hmm.
So if you haven't evolved the theory of control hasn't changed, but it's a little bit like painting the Golden Gate Bridge. If you have a brush, you can do it, but by the time you get finished, you got to start over again. And how do you know? That's the thing with control loops, is there's so many now, and if you don't figure out how to grab a hold of all of them to give you a heads up display, say, okay, these 5 are broke, go. And then I can distill and still apply. I don't want to take shortcuts on the theory and the tuning, but I can't spend so much time diagnosing 5,000 control loops. I need them to
Mm-hmm.
come to me and then apply the knowledge to that and then get the desired outcome that is important for my client.
Mm-hmm. So when you think about the challenge to provide employees that have bits of expertise across areas versus a lot of expertise in one area, how do you see that sort of playing out?
I think that's what the information age and the digital age and the industrial revolution that we're in is. When we what we're seeing is, if you force everybody to know everything, then not everybody can know everything. And so then they always feel a little bit like, for example, we were sending a guy to go do a feed study, and he was talking to the customer and said, okay, show me where this valve is. And the customer says, you're sitting on it. And we're like, the guy was really smart, but he didn't
Mm-hmm.
know that particular item. And so then it made him look bad and he was embarrassed. And so it's like, well, you can't know everything. I don't
Mm-hmm.
know about, there's a lot of stuff. So how do you get access? So that's where the distribution of the workforce and the regional, and kind of think of the Uber of service. You need to go someplace, if you have that app, they come and get you.
Mm-hmm.
It totally disrupted the cab industry. That's kind of where we're at in the service space, is
Mm-hmm.
you had to send one person to know everything. Well, it was made sense to me in the oil and gas sector, where when an offshore oil rig had a problem and they called in for help, you just didn't have 100,000 people that could go. You had a group of people, and then the guy's like, well, it could be this, or that. So let me grab a great big box of parts and hope that when I get to site, I've got the right one.
Mm-hmm.
Well, that's where I can still remember sitting with the customer saying, this isn't okay. I need to be able to make sure that when that person comes to the site, he's equipped with what he needs.
Mm-hmm.
Or better yet, if I can fix it without them even flying on the, that's kind of a dangerous, why put people in this danger when we can remotely bring them in?
Right.
So that's what we're seeing back to the state of the industry is technology and remote is changing so that we can kind of self adjust so that maybe you only need one or two advanced process control experts in your company, but you need, 20 or 30 control guys and you need 30 or 40 cyber guys, but you don't need them all in one place and you don't need them all at the same time.
Mm-hmm.
So learning how to dispatch them and orient them based on the need and getting their access and their scheduling, that's what we're seeing is the big change that's happening.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Now, we talked a little bit about, you were mentioning when your son was taking that class and was showing you what he's up to, and you're saying, well, that's it,
Yeah.
and, just the need here of making sure we don't overlook the core principles, right? That's kind of what your book does in a way, is make sure that people get the emphasis they need on what those core principles are. And you can update it so that it's reflective of, present day, but the underlying principles stay the same. It just makes me think there's probably other, areas of service and manufacturing and, the things that we talk about here often where that's applicable. Like, are we, trying to do all things, and overlooking some of the core elements? You know what I mean? Can you think of any other areas where that idea is applicable?
Oh yeah. I mean, I've been fortunate is to apply the concepts of process control. Once I started putting the inputs and outputs and realizing that once you can compare those, then you can put a control loop. A control loop is simply a device that takes action based upon an input. That's what's special about a PID. It literally makes a decision and makes a change. Most everything is a diagnostic tool. Control loops converted into action. And that's why it's also scary for a lot of people. If you set up the wrong things and that actuator starts moving and your sheet machine breaks down, then that's kind of scary. But I've been able to apply this. One example is I was in one of my positions, I was the software development manager for the global for software development. And I started seeing the relationship between developers and throughput. And I use the book here and the tuning for a tank to tune the backlog based on the capacity of my teams. And I was like,
Mm-hmm.
holy smokes, this stuff applies everywhere. As once
Mm-hmm.
you don't have to guess. So I was able to use these methods and apply them to the agile, extended agile Scrum team backlog and prioritization, which people are like, oh, really? And like, yeah, it worked. And I've seen that with even down to like this podcast. You'll see if you get 1 million views, you'll probably have me on sooner than later. If you get 10, it's probably my last view. But I mean, so we all take inputs and take action. That's a control
Mm-hmm.
function, and
Right.
that can be optimized. And that's what I find fascinating still is the optimization of all these processes.
Yeah. No, I agree. Now, if you think about, you mentioned the YouTube videos you created and how much traction you've seen there, right? So you started 30 years ago with writing this book. You had the opportunity to, more recently create those videos and relay the content of the chapters there. It just makes me think, people learn in different ways, right?
Yeah.
So when we think about empowering our teams with knowledge, what are some of the things we need to have in mind about how best we do that today?
I suppose in summary is to assume that everyone learns the same way is the biggest mistake, is to allow people to learn how they learn because the information and turning it into action is so important. And I guess that's where people need to recognize is there are different ways, whether it's video or text or remote or in person or a mentoring or apprenticeship. What we're doing in industrial and industrial control is important, and the safety of our people are at the utmost. But driving our clients to improve production quality and cost to produce sits on the back of knowledge, and that knowledge is something that leaves when people leave. We need to figure out how to capture that, and training and capture is one of the ways we can do it.
Yeah, that makes sense. And I think, you spoke earlier, Kevin, about how technology has allowed organizations to do so much of this work remotely. That also goes for sharing knowledge, right? I mean, you don't have to have access to experts that are in person. You can have access to them remotely, right? So there's a lot of different ways teams can collaborate and have that sort of over the shoulder, reassurance that you mentioned without that needing to be a physical presence. So I think that's a really good point. Okay, so I've certainly learned a lot so far today. Any other insights, comments, or lessons learned that you would like to share with our listeners?
Well, I suppose that's one of the lessons learned. I suppose is somewhat of a personal journey. In my quest to help solve industrial problems around the world, I had let the biggest industry kind of go on the back burner, which was me and my health. And my doctor said, "Look, if you don't turn things around, you're going to have a stroke or a heart attack." And that was when I turned 50. And so I was like, "Oh my." And I said, I go around using these techniques of troubleshooting and fixing industrial processes. I wonder if I can apply these skills to me. And so I did. I started recording the data. I found what inputs were outputs. I tracked everything down, and I started to. I went to my doctor and got physicals and asked for advice and applying it to myself. Basically, doing the bump test, identifying my process type. And all of a sudden, I started losing weight, and people started asking me questions. And then I started sharing the information. I said, I've been on this journey before when I wrote the control book. So I wonder if I could take this experience and write a book. And I did. I just released it called Tuned Fit, An Engineer's Journey into Health and Fitness.
I
So
love that.
I lost 50 pounds and became a master's athlete. And I never would have dreamed these possible. And I credited this book and going back 30 years ago, and putting that together. So it's been amazing, is what you allow yourself to learn and then to put it into action. And that
Yeah.
book's on Amazon. If anyone's interested, you go to Amazon and type Tuned Fit, you'll
Well,
find it.
congratulations, Kevin. That's awesome. I think, yeah, it is interesting how sometimes what we can put to work in our professional lives,
Oh yeah.
how it can be mirrored in our personal lives. I wrote an article not too long ago about, everyone wants the transformation, but are you willing to change, right?
Oh,
And the
that's good.
idea of how that applies both to organizations, but also to us as individuals. I know, I shared with you that, so I turned 40 in March, and at the beginning of this year, I realized I had put on, some COVID weight. And so I've lost probably 35 or so pounds
Awesome.
since the beginning of the year. And it is very much just, are you putting the focus in that you need to? Are you, paying attention to what works and what doesn't and making adjustments and all of that stuff? So yeah, there is definitely some parallels there. And I think it's really cool that you benefited from the hard work you've done and sharing your knowledge with others in a very personal way as well. So good for you.
And congratulations to you as well. That's a lot. But if your why isn't big enough to overcome your reasons, then you never change. And I
Right.
think back to the industry stuff, I'm so fortunate to have written a book that has lasted this long and people are asking for it again. But the pandemic, the growth of industrial automation, people are recognizing the core values and the core components, and knowledge and training and application, they're all kind of new again. And
Mm-hmm.
so this continuum, I was fortunate to touch it at the beginning with some great mentors. I feel like the flag was carried, and now we have stuff for the next generation to take with them. So it is
Mm-hmm.
technology is exciting, and knowledge is something we should never stop trying to gain.
Yeah, for sure. All right, Kevin. Well, thank you so much for coming and sharing with me. I appreciate it. If anyone is interested in checking out Kevin's books, you can reach out to him on LinkedIn. So last name is Starr with two R's. And you can look him up on LinkedIn, send him a message, and he'll point you in the right direction for either of the books. So thanks so much for coming on again and spending some more time with me.
Oh, thanks for having me. It was a pleasure. Appreciate it.
All right. You can also find more by visiting us at futureoffieldservice.com. You can find us on LinkedIn as well as Twitter at the Future of FS. The Future of Field Service podcast is published in partnership with IFS. You can learn more at ifs.com. As always, thank you for listening.